There is a date on the British royal calendar that most people barely notice. It does not come with a coronation or a funeral. There are no state processions, no foreign leaders flying in, no columns of guards in red jackets marching down the mall. It is just a birthday. A woman turns 79 years old and the palace puts out a photograph and the nation gives it a polite glance. That is what most people expected when July 17, 2026 arrived. A quiet birthday for a queen who had already survived decades of public hatred, survived the comparisons, survived the shadow of a woman the whole world loved, and she was blamed for destroying. But something happened the night before Camilla's birthday that nobody planned for. A photograph leaked, then another. Then a name surfaced that had not been spoken this loudly in royal circles for years. Diana. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a gentle moment of royal celebration became the most talked-about royal story of the summer. The phones started lighting up. The royal commentators went live. Thousands of people who had not thought about the crown jewels in their lives suddenly had opinions, strong ones, and they were not keeping them quiet. This is the story of how a 79th birthday became a royal earthquake, and why the name of a woman who has been dead for nearly 3 decades still has the power to shake a palace to its foundations. To understand why the photograph hit the way it did, you have to understand something about the woman in it, and about the woman whose ghost it conjured. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on July 17, 1947, into a family that moved comfortably in the upper circles of British society without quite being royal. Her father, Bruce Shand, was a decorated British Army officer. Her mother, Rosalind, came from aristocratic stock, the granddaughter of Roland Cubitt, the 3rd Baron Ashcombe. So the world Camilla grew up in was one of country houses, good manners, formal dinners, and the casual assumption that certain doors would always be open to you. It was a comfortable life, a private one. A life that gave no indication that the woman living it would one day become the most controversial figure in the history of the British monarchy. She met Charles, the Prince of Wales, in the early 1970s. They were young, they were drawn to each other, and by most accounts the connection between them was real and immediate. But Charles went away to serve in the Royal Navy, and while he was gone, Camilla married someone else. She wed Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, a British Army officer, and they had 2 children together, a son named Tom and a daughter named Laura. Charles, meanwhile, went on with his royal duties, and the world watched him with the particular fascination reserved for heirs to the throne. Who would he marry? What would she be like? The speculation went on for years, and then in 1981, the answer arrived in the form of a 20-year-old kindergarten teacher's assistant named Diana Spencer. Diana was young and luminous and utterly unprepared for what was about to happen to her. When she appeared on the steps of Buckingham Palace for the first time as the chosen bride of the Prince of Wales, something happened that nobody in the palace had quite expected. The public fell in love, not just with her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful, with that soft blonde hair and those downcast blue eyes, and that way of tilting her head as if she was always slightly shy. They fell in love with something harder to name. She seemed real in a way that royals were not supposed to seem. She seemed to feel things. When she held sick children in hospital wards, it did not look like a duty. When she sat on the edge of a patient's bed in an AIDS ward at a time when most of the world was still terrified to be in the same room as someone who was ill, she did it without gloves and without hesitation. The world noticed. The world remembered. On her wedding day, July 29, 1981, Diana walked into St. Paul's Cathedral wearing a dress with a train that stretched 153 yards behind her, and on her head she wore the Spencer tiara. She had been offered another option. Queen Elizabeth had been willing to lend her the Cambridge Lovers' Knot tiara, a piece so magnificent it made rooms go quiet, but Diana chose her own family's heirloom instead. It was a quiet act of independence, the kind that made royal watchers raise their eyebrows. Even before she had officially become a princess, Diana was doing things her own way. The tiara she chose that day was a diamond bandeau in the garland style, its scrolling floral patterns built from pieces that her family had gathered over generations. It was not the grandest crown in the room, but it was hers. The wedding was watched by an estimated 750 million people around the world. The Spencer tiara sat under the lights of one of the most watched events in human history and became something more than jewelry. It became a symbol of the woman wearing it. And the woman wearing it, for better and for worse, was about to become the most photographed, the most adored, and eventually the most grieved person on earth. What happened inside the marriage is a story that most people think they know. Charles and Diana were mismatched from the start in ways that went beyond age difference or temperament. He was a man formed by a tradition that prized duty above feeling. She was a woman who led with her heart and could not understand a world that asked her to stop. They tried, by all accounts. But trying was not enough, and the fractures showed faster than anyone in the palace would publicly admit. By the mid-80s, the marriage had broken apart in the only way royal marriages were allowed to break apart then, quietly, privately, and with everyone maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. It was not fine, and Camilla Parker Bowles was part of why. The affair between Charles and Camilla, which had never entirely ended even through his engagement and marriage to Diana, became the thing that everyone knew and no one said out loud until they could no longer hold it in. When recordings of an intimate phone call between Charles and Camilla were published in 1993, the pretense collapsed entirely. Diana, in her own way, had already begun to strike back. She had given interviews. She had worn what became known as the revenge dress. She had stepped into the public consciousness not as a wronged wife hiding behind palace gates, but as a woman who was going to make sure the world understood her version of events. When she sat down with the BBC's Martin Bashir in 1995 and said that there were 3 people in her marriage, the line became one of the most repeated sentences in the history of British television. The divorce was finalized in 1996. Diana returned the Cambridge lovers, not Tiara, to the royal vault. The Spencer tiara went back to her family, where it belonged, where it had always belonged. Diana herself continued her work, her humanitarian trips, her campaigns against landmines, her advocacy for the sick and the suffering and the invisible. She was, if anything, more beloved after the divorce than during it. The crown had let her go, and the people had pulled her closer. On August 31, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. The grief that followed was unlike anything Britain had seen in living memory. People who had never met her, who had only seen her photograph, who had only watched her on television from thousands of miles away, stood outside Buckingham Palace and wept. The flowers piled up outside Kensington Palace until they stretched as far as you could see. The palace, for the first few days, did not respond in the way the public needed it to, and the nation's anger turned briefly on the institution itself, on its coldness, on its inability to mourn as the rest of the country was mourning. The Queen eventually came out. She eventually spoke. But it was too late to fully repair the damage. Something had shifted in the relationship between the British public and their royal family, and the name most associated with that shift, the name that carried the weight of all that complicated history, was Camilla. For years after Diana's death, Camilla Parker Bowles could barely be seen in public without a reaction. The hostility was sometimes open and sometimes quiet, but it was almost always there. She and Charles continued their relationship, navigating a world that had rendered its verdict on both of them, and specifically on her, with extraordinary clarity. She was the villain of the story. She was the woman who had taken Diana's husband. She was the one who had made the princess cry. That the full story was considerably more complicated than that relationships rarely fracture because of a single person's choices, that Diana herself had relationships outside the marriage, that Charles and Camilla's bond predated his marriage to Diana by years. None of that cut through the clean lines of public narrative. Camilla was guilty. Diana was innocent, and that was largely how it stayed. Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony in April 2005. The country accepted it, if not entirely warmly. She became the Duchess of Cornwall. She declined the title Princess of Wales because that title belonged to Diana in the public imagination, and everyone involved understood it. She worked quietly, took on charitable causes, showed up for duties without drama or complaint, and slowly, over the course of years, the tide of public opinion began to shift. It never shifted entirely. There were people who would never forgive her and were not interested in being persuaded otherwise. But the woman who had once been publicly booed on the streets of Britain was, by the time King Charles III took the throne in September 2022, something she had once seemed utterly unlikely to become. She was respected. The coronation on May 6, 2023, was the official moment of arrival. Camilla was crowned Queen Consort of the United Kingdom alongside her husband. She wore Queen Mary's crown, a historic piece that had been modified at her request to avoid using the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a stone with a controversial colonial history that she had asked not to include as a gesture of sensitivity. That single decision said a great deal about the woman who had made it. She was not merely going through the motions of queenship. She was thinking about what it meant, and she was making choices accordingly. As queen, Camilla inherited something extraordinary. When she became queen consort following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, she inherited what is widely considered the largest collection of jewelry in the world, estimated to be worth in the region of £100 million. The collection spans centuries and continents. It includes pieces that once belonged to queens and empresses and society hostesses across the entire arc of British royal history. Since King Charles III's coronation in 2023, Camilla has worn Queen Elizabeth II's favorite girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, Queen Alexandra's Kokoshnik tiara, and other magnificent heirloom pieces. Natural diamonds, natural diamonds. She has worn these pieces with evident care and knowledge. She has chosen them for their historical significance as much as their beauty. She has worn certain pieces at certain events in deliberate homage to the queens who wore them before her. The woman who was once dismissed by royal observers as too plain, too ordinary, too unroyal, had grown into her role with something that nobody had initially predicted. She had grown into it with genuine dignity. But dignity in a family with the history of the Windsors is never quite far from its opposite. And as Camilla's 79th birthday approached, something was building in the background that the palace had not anticipated and that Camilla herself could not control. It started, as so many things do now, with a photograph. And it ended with a name that no birthday party, no matter how elegant, no matter how carefully planned, could compete with. The name was Diana. And the story of how that name came roaring back into the headlines on the eve of Camilla's birthday is a story about jewelry, about memory, about the strange and enduring power of objects to carry the weight of everything we feel about the people who once wore them. The crown jewels of the British royal family are not, strictly speaking, the personal property of any individual member of the family. This is a fact that most people understand in an abstract sense, but do not fully feel until something happens to make it vivid. The jewels are part of the royal collection. They are held in trust for the nation. They pass from monarch to monarch, from queen to queen, from one royal woman's head to the next, following a logic of institutional continuity rather than personal inheritance. When Diana returned the Cambridge lover's not tiara to the royal vault after her divorce from Charles, she was not giving away her own possession. She was returning a piece that had only ever been on loan to her, a loan made by the institution she was leaving. This is the framework that explains how Camilla can wear pieces that Diana once wore. It is the framework that explains how Kate Middleton, now Princess Catherine, can put the lover's not tiara on her head and walk into a state banquet and draw every eye in the room. The tiara belongs to the crown. The crown belongs to the institution. The institution continues regardless of who is loved and who is mourned and who is blamed for what. But frameworks, however logical, have never been particularly good at managing grief. And what happened in the days leading up to Camilla's 79th birthday was not primarily a legal or institutional story. It was an emotional one. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had worn the lover's not tiara, which was created for Queen Mary in 1913 and later worn by Diana, at the Nigerian state banquet at Windsor Castle in March 2026. Photographs of Catherine in the tiara had circulated widely, drawing the usual wave of comparisons to Diana. This had become a pattern over the years. Every time Catherine wore the lover's knot, the photographs were placed side by side with images of Diana wearing it, and people looked at them and felt something complicated and personal and sometimes beautiful. It was a form of remembrance. Catherine herself seemed to understand this. At the Nigerian state banquet, which was held on Mother's Day in Britain, Catherine's choice of Diana's tiara appeared to be a gentle gesture of remembrance for William's mother and grandmother. The court jeweler, the court jeweler. So the lover's knot was already in the conversation. Diana's name was already circulating in that particular current that runs through royal coverage whenever a tiara appears in a photograph. And then something else happened. In the days before July 17, a series of images began circulating online and in tabloid media that reignited a conversation that had never really gone quiet. They were not new photographs. Some of them were archival. But they were being presented together in a new context, a framing that asked a pointed question about the pieces of jewelry that Camilla had been photographed wearing as queen, and which of those pieces had once been part of Diana's world. The framing was deliberate. It was designed to provoke a reaction, and it worked. One piece at the center of the debate was a stunning necklace featuring 4 carats of white diamonds and green emeralds, with 3 ostrich feathers in the center that are part of the heraldic badge of the Prince of Wales. The necklace boasted 18 stones in total, and was originally gifted in 1863 to Queen Alexandra, who later passed it on to the Queen Mother. Diana had worn it. The piece had returned to the royal vault after her death. Camilla had later been photographed in it. That had caused controversy once before, years earlier, when it emerged that the piece had been altered. Camilla had reportedly caused controversy by remodeling pieces from the royal collection that had previously been associated with Diana. Reader's Digest. The specific detail about remodeling was the detail that had always provoked the strongest reaction. Wearing the same piece that Diana wore was one thing. The logic of the royal collection made that explainable, if not always comfortable. But altering it, changing it, making it fit differently or look different, felt to many people like something beyond institutional continuity. It felt like erasure. One iconic Diana piece was a necklace made up of 4-carat diamonds and green emeralds, featuring 3 ostrich feathers that were part of the heraldic badge of the Prince of Wales. Diana was given the brooch on her wedding day by the Queen Mother, and although it was a gift to the princess, it became part of the royal collection after her death, which meant Camilla then had access to it. Royal Insider. And there was the Spencer tiara again. Not Camilla wearing it, she could not wear it. The Spencer tiara had never been part of the royal collection and remained firmly with the Spencer family, exactly where Diana would have wanted it. Camilla does not have access to the Spencer jewelry, including the Spencer tiara. But the tiara kept surfacing in the coverage regardless, because it is the piece most indelibly associated with Diana, the piece she wore on the day the world first saw her, the piece that had been passed down through generations of her family, and that would continue to be passed down through generations to come. The Spencer tiara is, in some sense, Diana's answer to everything the crown claimed it owned. It is the thing that always belonged to her, not to the institution, not to the collection, not to whoever happened to be queen next. Hers, Quora. Diana wore the Spencer tiara often during her 15-year time at the palace, wearing it at state dinners, on tour around the globe, and at diplomatic events. Diana last wore the Spencer tiara publicly in 1993, and after she passed away, it returned to the Spencer family. It was most recently worn in 2018 at the wedding of Diana's niece. Yahoo! Reader's Digest. The fact that the Spencer tiara was safely in Spencer family hands did not stop people from feeling, viscerally and loudly, that something was wrong about the convergence of Camilla's birthday and the renewed attention on royal jewels and Diana's memory. Social media in the days before July 17 filled with posts that ranged from thoughtful and historically grounded to raw and furious. The grounded posts explained, carefully, that most of what Camilla wore was part of the royal collection and always had been. They pointed out that many pieces of Diana's jewelry were actually part of the royal collection, which is passed down through generations of the family and the monarch, and that while her sons William and Harry chose pieces from her collection as heirlooms, they did not inherit all of it. Royal Insider. The furious posts did not care about frameworks. They cared about Diana. They cared about the fact that a woman they had loved was gone, and that the woman many of them still held responsible for the end of her marriage was turning 79 in a garden at Highgrove while the public was being reminded, yet again, of the jewels Diana had worn and where those jewels now lived. Royal experts tried to manage the narrative. Some went on television. Some wrote pieces explaining the legalities. Most royal jewelry belongs to the crown estate rather than to Diana or to Queen Camilla, and Camilla has her own family jewelry to rely on as well. These explanations were accurate. They were also, in the emotional temperature of the moment, almost entirely beside the point. Quora. Because the argument was never really about jewelry law. It was never really about who technically owned which tiara or who had the legal right to modify which necklace. The argument was about something much older and much harder to resolve. It was about love and loss and the human instinct to protect the memory of someone you grieve by keeping the things associated with them exactly as they were, unchanged, untouched, belonging in your imagination to the person who made them meaningful. Diana had made these objects meaningful. Not the institution, not the history, not the centuries of royal provenance. Diana, with her downcast eyes and her tilted head and her way of making every room feel like she was talking directly to you. She had worn the lover's knot and given it her tears and her headaches and her determination to keep wearing it anyway because she understood what it meant for her to be seen in it. She had worn the Spencer tiara on the most watched day of her life and made it the most famous crown in the world. She had taken the cold and the formal and the institutional, and she had breathed something warm and human into it. And when she died, what she had breathed into it did not simply disappear. It stayed. It stayed in the way people reacted to Catherine wearing the lover's knot and seeing Diana's face. It stayed in the way people bristled at photographs of Camilla in pieces that had touched Diana's skin. It stayed in the conversation that erupted on the eve of Camilla's birthday, pulling the internet into an argument about the dead and the living and the things that pass between them. The palace, for its part, said nothing. This was not unusual. The palace almost never responds to social media controversy, a policy of silence that can look like dignity or indifference depending on who you ask. According to former royal employees, Camilla's birthday was being planned as a traditional private celebration at Highgrove, where King Charles was expected to give her a simple but thoughtful present, likely something connected to the garden, which she loves. Cheat sheet. There would be no grand statement, no press conference, no acknowledgement of the storm gathering outside the palace gates. Inside, a woman was about to turn 79, and the people who loved her were planning something quiet and personal and warm. Outside, the internet was on fire with her name next to Diana's, and the debate about jewelry and memory and what it means to be the woman who came after was playing out in real time across every platform and in every language that royal coverage had found its way into. The question was not going to be answered by the birthday itself, but the birthday was about to throw new fuel onto a debate that had never really stopped burning. When Camilla woke up on the morning of July 17, 2026, she turned 79 years old in a country that could not decide how to feel about her. This was not a new situation. It was, in some ways, the defining situation of her adult life. She had spent decades being judged, mourned, resented, slowly accepted, and then in the strange way of public opinion, reconsidered. She had become queen without ever fully escaping the shadow of the woman who had preceded her in the public imagination. And she had done it anyway, one day at a time, one public engagement at a time, with a consistency and a steadiness that her most committed critics could not quite discredit no matter how hard they tried. The birthday photographs released by Buckingham Palace showed a woman at ease. Over the years, Camilla's birthday portraits had become an established tradition, with new photos released to mark the occasion. The images showed her in a garden, relaxed, carrying the particular quality of someone who has stopped trying to prove something to anyone and has arrived, finally, at a version of herself she is comfortable living in. Royal photographers noted that the setting was intimate and personal. Those who knew her history recognized the significance of a backdrop connected to the private life she had always carefully maintained outside her public role. Woman and home. But the calm of those photographs was at odds with the weather outside the palace walls. The conversation about Diana's tiara, which had been building for days, had not quieted overnight. If anything, it had intensified because now there was a specific date attached to it. The controversy had a name and a number. Camilla's 79th birthday and Diana's tiara. The headline combination was irresistible to the tabloid press, and they did what they always do with irresistible combinations. They ran with it. The coverage broke down, as royal coverage almost always does, into two distinct camps that talked past each other with impressive persistence. The first camp was the one that understood the institutional framework. Queen Camilla has been seen wearing pieces associated with Princess Diana over the years, but the rules of the royal family are clear. Most of the jewelry belongs to the monarch and is part of the royal collection, not the personal property of any individual royal. This camp pointed to the historical record. It pointed to the fact that Catherine, Princess of Wales, wore Diana's beloved lover's knot tiara regularly, and had done so without this level of controversy because Catherine was Diana's daughter-in-law and was understood to be honoring Diana's memory by wearing it. It pointed to the distinction between pieces that were part of the royal collection and pieces that belonged to the Spencer family and had never been and would never be accessible to anyone outside it. Royal insider. The Spencer tiara was the most important example of this distinction. The Spencer tiara belongs to the Spencer family and has only ever been worn by Spencer brides. When Diana wore it on her wedding day in 1981, it became one of the most famous tiaras in modern history. As of 2025, the Spencer tiara belongs to Diana's brother Charles and will likely be passed down to his son when he inherits the title of Earl of Spencer. Camilla could not wear it. She had never worn it. She would never wear it. The suggestion that the Spencer tiara was somehow at risk, that it was somehow part of the birthday controversy, was factually wrong. Natural diamonds, Yahoo! But facts had a limited market in the emotional firestorm of the day. The second camp, the one that drove most of the volume online, was not making a legal argument. It was making a moral one. It was saying that there is something wrong about celebrating the birthday of the woman widely blamed for Diana's marital suffering, while simultaneously reminding the world of the jewels that Diana wore and where those jewels have ended up. It was saying that the institutional framework, however accurate, feels tone-deaf to anyone who still carries grief for Diana. And that grief, 29 years after her death, turned out to be more alive than anyone in the palace had anticipated when July arrived. The royal commentators did their work. They sat in television studios and explained, carefully and with visible effort, that the coverage was conflating several different things. They separated the Spencer tiara from the royal collection pieces. They explained that after Charles and Diana's divorce, Diana was obligated to return the Cambridge Lovers' not tiara to Queen Elizabeth II, and after Diana's death the tiara had not been seen until Kate Middleton first wore it in 2015. They explained that this was normal and legal and had nothing to do with Camilla. They explained it with patience and they explained it with precision, and then the next wave of posts arrived and the explaining started again. The knot. What was striking, watching the conversation unfold across the day of Camilla's birthday, was not the argument itself. The argument had been had before, many times, in many forms. What was striking was the evidence it provided of something that the palace had perhaps underestimated. Diana's hold on the public imagination was not weakening with time. The Cambridge Lovers' Not tiara has been adored by 4 generations of royal women, and Diana's association with it has made it inextricably linked to her enduring royal style. More than that, Diana's hold was being actively renewed by the generation that had not lived through her life in real time, the generation that had come to know her through documentaries and podcasts and streaming series, and the endless archive of photographs and footage that the internet had made permanently accessible. Natural diamonds. This was a new Diana, in some ways. She was no longer just the memory of people who had stood outside Buckingham Palace in 1997 with flowers in their hands. She was also the discovery of people born after her death, people who had found her through a streaming service or a social media account dedicated to her archive and had fallen for her with the intensity that parasocial relationships generate at speed. For these people, the pain was not the dull ache of old grief. It was fresh. It was immediate. And it made the birthday of the woman they associated with her suffering feel like a provocation. Camilla, for her part, spent her birthday in the manner that had been described. Private, family-focused, grounded in the garden and the routines and the small pleasures that had always, through every wave of public opinion about her, constituted her actual life. She had learned, over many decades of being a public target, that the only way to survive it was to refuse to be entirely defined by it. She had her own history. She had her own children and grandchildren. She had a husband who loved her with an intensity that had survived 30 years of scandal and public judgment. She had the work she had done, the charitable causes she had built, the role she had grown into with a patience and a seriousness that even her critics struggled to dismiss entirely. Former royal employees who had worked with Camilla described how much her role had changed since Charles became king, and how she had come to the forefront as a remarkable individual. They described her as a huge support for her husband, and noted that her background, while privileged, had prepared her in some ways for the transition into royal life. The woman who had once been the most reviled person in Britain had, somehow without fanfare and without drama, become something else. She had become a queen who did the work. Chi-chi. None of that was going to resolve the conversation that raged around her birthday. The conversation was not really about Camilla. It was about Diana. It was always about Diana. It was about the particular quality of Diana's life and death that made her impossible to let go of, that made the objects she touched, and the titles she held, and the tiaras she wore into charged things, emotional things, things that carried meaning far beyond their weight in diamonds and gold. The Cambridge lover's knot tiara, which Diana had worn so often that it had given her headaches, and she had worn it anyway, sat in the royal vault. The Princess of Wales, Catherine, had worn it at major royal occasions, including state banquets and diplomatic receptions, making it the most frequently worn headpiece in her rotation since she first chose it in 2015. It would be worn again. It would appear again in photographs that would be placed beside photographs of Diana wearing it, and the comparison would draw the same rush of feeling it always drew. Natural diamonds. The Spencer tiara was where it had always been, in the care of the family that owned it, in the line of inheritance that Diana's brother would pass to his son when the time came. When Diana wore it on her wedding day, it became one of the most famous pieces in modern royal history, and its close association with her means it will always carry her identity wherever it goes. It was not in Camilla's hands. It was not in the palace. It was not in the royal collection. It was safe, in the way that only things which have never been taken can be said to be safe. Natural diamonds. And the woman who had never been able to touch, it turned 79 in a garden, surrounded by the people who loved her, while the internet argued about the dead and the living and the long, complicated distance between them. There is a question that gets asked in various forms whenever the royal family becomes the subject of this kind of controversy, a question about what it means for a family so ancient and so damaged and so endlessly watched to try to move forward. How do you honor the past without being imprisoned by it? How do you pass down the objects and the titles and the traditions without endlessly reopening the wounds attached to them? There is no clean answer. There has never been a clean answer. The British monarchy has been accumulating its wounds for 1,000 years, and carries every one of them still. What the 79th birthday of Queen Camilla revealed was not new information. It revealed something that everyone who pays attention to the royal family already knows. Diana is not history. Diana is not over. She is present in the conversations that erupt around the jewelry she once wore, in the photographs placed beside photographs of her daughter-in-law wearing the same tiara, in the grief of people who never met her and feel they lost something real when she died. She is present in the way Camilla is still, after all these years, still measured against her shadow. That presence is not comfortable for anyone. It is not comfortable for Camilla, who has spent her life navigating it. It is not comfortable for William and Harry, who carry it differently, and whose relationship with each other has been shaped in ways both visible and invisible by the grief it represents. It is not comfortable for Catherine, who wears the tiaras with evident respect and still finds herself in the middle of comparisons she did not ask for. But discomfort is not the same as injustice, and the continued presence of Diana in the public imagination is not, at its heart, an accusation. It is a tribute. It is the particular tribute that a person earns when they have touched enough lives deeply enough that the people whose lives they touched cannot quite bring themselves to put them down. Camilla's 79th birthday came and went. The photographs went up. The coverage cycled through its stages: shock, debate, explanation, exhaustion, and eventual quieting. The tiaras stayed where they were. The Spencer tiara stayed with the Spencers. The lover's knot stayed in the vault and on Catherine's head at the occasions that called for it. The crown jewels continued to exist as they had always existed, beautiful and heavy and belonging, technically, to an institution rather than a person. But in the thing that matters most, in the emotional truth that outlasts legal frameworks and institutional claims and carefully worded palace statements, the jewels will always carry her. The woman in the Spencer tiara on that July morning in 1981, walking into the light of 750 million watching eyes. The woman who wore the lover's knot until it gave her headaches and wore it anyway. The woman who made the cold and the formal feel warm just by standing in the room. Camilla turned 79. The headlines wrote themselves around Diana's name, and somewhere in all of it, buried under the noise and the argument and the relentless cycle of royal controversy, was the simple and inescapable truth that both of these women, for better and for worse and in all the messy complicated territory between, had been changed forever by the same man, the same institution, the same ancient and unyielding machine that chews through lives and calls it tradition. The birthday ended, the argument didn't. It never does.